Las Vegas, 1972. Under the blinding blue spotlights, Elvis Presley stopped mid-song and locked eyes with an 80-year-old woman in the front row. The king smiled, then asked her one simple question. And when she answered, 18,000 people fell silent, before the entire arena began to cry. Las Vegas Hilton, November 14th, 1972. The air buzzed like electricity trapped in a golden cage. Camera flashes painted the room in white fire. Sequins shimmered across Elvis Presley's jumpsuit as the brass section kicked in, shaking the floorboards. 18,000 people were on their feet. Some screamed, some cried. Everyone believed they were watching a god in motion, but among them sat one person who didn't move. An old woman in the front row, small and still, her hands folded in her lap. Her name, though no one knew it yet, was Martha Reynolds. The spotlight didn't touch her, but Elvis saw her anyway. From the stage, he could read faces, joy, awe, even obsession, but Martha's face was different. Quiet, kind. Like she'd already lived through everything the songs were trying to explain. He noticed the tissue trembling in her hand, the rings on her fingers that caught the light. Something about her silence pulled him in stronger than any scream. He sang C.C. Rider with his usual fire, but his eyes kept drifting back. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe fate. The band could feel it too. A subtle change, a tension that made even the trumpets sound softer. The crowd roared louder. Elvis smiled, but inside he was wondering who she was. Was she alone? Was she here for the music or for something else entirely? When the song ended, applause crashed like a wave. Elvis bowed, wiped his brow, and laughed into the mic. "You all sound mighty fine tonight," he said. "I see we got folks from every corner of the country here." He scanned the front rows, the sea of flashbulbs, the feverish faces. Then his gaze found her again. For a split second, it felt like the whole room disappeared. He leaned forward, resting one hand on the mic stand. "Mom," he said gently, his voice breaking through the noise. "You doing all right down there?" The crowd turned, realizing who he was speaking to. Thousands of eyes followed his line of sight. To the tiny woman in the floral dress. She nodded shyly. Elvis smiled. "You look about as sweet as Sunday morning," he said, earning a ripple of laughter from the stands. But Martha didn't laugh. She just smiled back, that soft, knowing kind of smile that can't be faked, the kind that says, "I've been waiting for this moment my whole life." The band looked at each other. Was this scripted? No, this wasn't in any rehearsal. Colonel Parker's face tightened somewhere in the wings. Elvis was off script again. The king strummed the first note of "Can't Help Falling in Love." His voice slowed, like he was measuring every word, letting it land exactly where she could hear it. The arena lights softened. Couples held hands. The old woman closed her eyes. For a few seconds, it was like the world had stopped spinning. And yet, even as he sang, Elvis couldn't shake the question forming in his mind. "Who are you?" When he hit the final note, the hall exploded with cheers. But Elvis didn't bow. He didn't leave the stage. Instead, he tilted his head toward Martha again, eyes narrowing in curiosity. He could feel the pull of something bigger than a show, a story waiting to unfold right there, under the blue lights. What makes a legend notice the one person no one else sees? How do we choose who deserves our attention in a sea of noise? The band waited for his cue to start the next number, but Elvis didn't move. He just stared, silent, almost smiling. Then, in front of 18,000 people, he stepped closer to the mic, and in a quiet voice that even the back row could hear, he said, "Ma'am, may I ask you something?" The crowd froze. The lights dimmed. The night changed forever. The microphone buzzed softly as Elvis leaned forward. His voice came out low, gentle, like he was talking to an old friend instead of performing for 18,000 people. "Ma'am," he said again, "how old are you, honey?" The question rippled through the audience like a gust of wind. People laughed, unsure whether to clap or wait. The spotlight drifted toward her. The elderly woman in the floral dress, blinking under the glare. Martha Reynolds stood slowly, her knees trembling. She cupped a hand to her ear, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd heard. I said, "How old are you, darling?" Elvis repeated, smiling wide. A hush fell over the arena. For a moment, it was so quiet, you could hear the click of a camera shutter somewhere in the balcony. Martha raised her voice, shaky but proud. 80 years old today, Mr. Presley, 80. The word hit the crowd like thunder. People gasped, then cheered. The sound swelled and rolled through the hall, a wave of disbelief and warmth. Elvis blinked, half in awe. 80, he said. "Well, happy birthday, sweetheart." The crowd roared again, louder this time, but he lifted a hand to calm them. He wasn't done. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at her. 80 years old, he repeated softly. "And you came all the way out here tonight." For me, the question hung in the air. It wasn't a joke anymore. His tone had shifted. The playful grin faded into something more sincere. Martha's lips trembled. She looked up at him, eyes glistening under the spotlight. And in that silence, she answered in a voice that carried to the farthest seat in the balcony. "No, son," she said. "I came because you remind me that life isn't over yet." The crowd gasped again, but this time no one clapped. No one spoke. Every head turned toward her. Every camera froze. Elvis stared, his jaw tight, as if he'd just been hit by something invisible. The drummer lowered his sticks. The brass players glanced at each other, waiting for a cue that didn't come. The silence was total, and then, slowly, Elvis laughed. Not a stage laugh, a real human laugh, low and raw. He wiped his face with a towel and said, "Well, honey, I think you just gave me the best reason to sing I ever heard." The audience erupted again, louder than before. People were crying, couples hugged. Somewhere near the back, a woman whispered, "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." But the moment wasn't over, because as the applause thundered, Elvis didn't step back to his mark. He didn't turn toward the band or cue the next number. Instead, he lowered the mic to his side and looked straight into Martha's eyes. He mouthed something the cameras couldn't catch. 3 silent words. "Thank you, Mom." Then he nodded to the orchestra, but not for the next scheduled song. The conductor blinked, unsure. "Elvis," someone muttered backstage. "What's he doing?" The colonel shifted in the shadows, already furious. He hated surprises, especially sentimental ones, but Elvis didn't care. He turned back to the mic, his voice steady again. "Folks," he said, "I think this lady deserves a song of her own tonight." The band hesitated. Then he gave them the key. The first slow notes of "You'll Never Walk Alone" filled the air. The brass softened, the lights dimmed to gold. As he sang, Elvis kept his eyes on her. Every lyric sounded different, not just a performance, but a promise. When he hit the line, "Walk on through the rain," you could see Martha mouthing the words too, tears rolling down her cheeks. What would you have done if you were him? Followed the script or followed your heart? How often do we forget that one kind word can rewrite a night? The crowd swayed like a living ocean. Some people knelt, others just stood in awe. Even the ushers stopped moving. And then, just as the final note rang through the hall, Elvis set the mic down. The colonel's voice barked from the wings. "Get back to the show!" But Elvis didn't move. He stepped down off the stage, breaking the one rule he'd sworn to never break. The brass players froze. The stagehands froze. Even the colonel froze, because Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was stepping down from the stage, right into the crowd. The spotlight followed him, trembling to keep up as the security team hesitated. The crowd gasped, then erupted into screams. Hands reached out. Cameras flashed like lightning. But Elvis wasn't chasing fame in that moment. He was chasing something real. He moved past the first few rows, nodding gently to the fans until he reached her. Martha Reynolds, the woman who'd just reminded him that life still had music left in it. She looked up, eyes wide behind her glasses. Her lips trembled. "You shouldn't come down here," she whispered. Elvis smiled, soft and easy. "Ma'am, I've been told not to do a lot of things." The crowd laughed, but it wasn't his usual joke. There was something pure about it, something unscripted. He took the blue silk scarf from around his neck, the one he always threw to the audience at the end of the night, and gently draped it over her shoulders. "Then tonight," he said, "the king sings just for you." For a moment, you could almost hear the click of every camera capturing it. Flashbulbs bursting, hearts breaking. The colonel shouted something from the wings, but the music started anyway. Elvis turned back to the band, lifted his hand and said, "Play it slow." And that's when it began. A song that wasn't on any set list that night. "You'll Never Walk Alone." The pianist found the key. The strings eased in. The drummer set his brushes down and used his hands instead, soft and steady. Elvis sang it like a prayer. "Walk on through the wind." His voice cracked slightly, but it only made it more human, more sacred. The arena fell into silence. No screaming, no flashing lights, just thousands of people breathing together, hanging on each word. Somewhere backstage, the colonel covered his face. He knew this wasn't a performance anymore. It was a confession. The old woman closed her eyes. Tears traced lines through her makeup, catching the glow from the stage. She held the scarf tightly, like it carried some kind of promise. And in that stillness, something shifted. Fans who had come to see a superstar were now watching a man stripped of the stage, the glitter, the myth, standing in front of a stranger who somehow reminded him why he started singing in the first place. When he reached the final chorus, Elvis stopped looking at the crowd altogether. He looked only at her. Walk on, with hope in your heart." His eyes filled with tears, his lip trembled, and for one heartbeat, it was like time stood still. Then, silence. Total, perfect silence. Not a soul dared to clap. The sound of the last note floated through the room and vanished into air that felt holy. A camera flash snapped. A baby cried somewhere in the upper balcony, and then the dam broke. Applause, screams, people shouting his name through tears. Elvis smiled faintly, nodded to the orchestra, and kissed Martha's hand. He whispered, "You keep walking now. Promise me." She nodded, too moved to speak. He straightened, looked back toward the stage, and called out to the crowd. "You hear that, folks? We all keep walking." The place went wild. Even the colonel couldn't stop it now, because for the first time in a long time, Elvis wasn't performing for them. He was with them. As he climbed back on stage, the audience stayed standing. Some fans raised lighters, others just closed their eyes, holding onto the moment like something fragile. The orchestra picked up "Love Me Tender," but this time it sounded different, slower, warmer, almost like a lullaby. What would you have done in that moment? Stayed behind the rules or crossed the line for something that mattered? How many times in life do we get the chance to break a rule for kindness instead of rebellion? Elvis turned once more toward Martha before the song ended. She was smiling now, her eyes shining under the spotlight. And as he sang the final line, "And I always will," the lights faded to gold, but no one expected what the old woman would do next. The spotlight still hovered over Martha as Elvis stood above her, bathed in gold light. The song had ended, but no one moved. The orchestra waited for a cue that didn't come, and then quietly, the old woman reached into her purse. The entire front row leaned forward. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a small, wrinkled photograph, the edges worn, the color faded to sepia. She held it out toward him. "This was my boy," she whispered. Elvis bent down. The microphone caught her words, barely, but enough for the first few rows to hear. And then silence swallowed the rest of the arena. She looked up at him. "He loved your songs. He never made it home from Korea." The crowd gasped as one. It was like someone had cut the air out of the room. Elvis froze. The photograph sat in his hand. A young man in uniform, no older than 20. He had the same half-smile Elvis once wore in his own army photo. His throat tightened. The lights dimmed a little more. Somewhere backstage, A crew member turned off his headset to wipe his eyes. The colonel muttered, "End the show." But no one dared move. Elvis swallowed hard. He turned back toward Martha, still holding the photo. His voice broke slightly when he said, "He's here tonight, ma'am." The microphone caught it, just enough for the audience to hear. "He's here tonight." A hush swept through the entire hall. You could hear the hum of the amplifiers, the creak of the stage boards, the shallow breathing of thousands of people who suddenly forgot how to make noise. Elvis pressed the photo against his chest, eyes glistening. For a heartbeat, he looked less like a king, more like a man who understood loss. And then, slowly, he lifted the photo high, letting the lights hit it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, "this is why we sing." The words echoed through the loudspeakers. Simple, but heavy. Someone in the balcony began to cry. A few more followed. Then the entire arena broke into applause. Not wild or chaotic, but slow, rhythmic, reverent. Clap, clap, clap. 18,000 people standing in silence, honoring a soldier they'd never met. Elvis blinked hard, trying to hold it together. His voice shook as he whispered, "This one's for him." The band started playing again, softly, instinctively. The same melody from before, but stripped of glamour, just piano and strings. Elvis handed the photo back to Martha and kissed her forehead. The cameras tried to follow, but the lights were too dim now. The only thing visible was his white jumpsuit glowing faintly as he sang one more verse. When you walk through the storm, you could feel it, that invisible thread between the stage and the audience. Somewhere in that massive room, hearts were healing, and when he reached the final line, "You'll never walk alone," he didn't sing it loud. He whispered it straight into the mic like a secret. Then, silence again. Every flashbulb stopped. The audience stood still, tears streaming. Even the colonel's eyes were wet. That's the thing about grief. It sneaks up in the most unexpected places, and sometimes all it takes to unlock it is one song, one voice, one moment of kindness. Elvis reached for her hand once more. "You keep that photo close now," he said softly. Martha smiled faintly. "Don't you worry," she said. "I've kept it close for 20 years. He nodded, eyes still wet. Then tonight we all did. For 30 full seconds, no one dared to speak. No one wanted to break the spell. Then the crowd exploded, a roar so loud it made the lights shake overhead. People threw scarves, hats, even rings onto the stage. It wasn't just applause anymore. It was gratitude. Backstage, the colonel muttered, "I can't believe he did that." But his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Larry Geller, Elvis's close friend, whispered, "He needed to." And maybe that was true, because that night, Elvis didn't just give a show. He gave something of himself he'd been hiding for years. When he finally turned back to the microphone, he said quietly, "All right, folks, let's keep this show rolling." But even as the next song began, his voice carried a tremor, one that hadn't been there before, because deep down, Elvis knew this moment would follow him forever. Backstage, even the colonel had tears in his eyes, but Elvis wasn't done yet. When the final encore ended, the crowd still refused to leave. They stayed standing, clapping, crying, some just whispering, "Thank you." The lights came up slowly, like dawn over a battlefield. Elvis waved, bowed, and disappeared behind the curtain. But the moment didn't leave him. He could still see her, the old woman with the scarf, the photograph, and those eyes that saw straight through him. Backstage was chaos, crew rushing, cameras clicking, Colonel Parker barking orders. Yet Elvis stood frozen near the stairwell, his hands still trembling slightly. Larry Geller, his close friend and spiritual advisor, touched his shoulder. "You okay, E?" Elvis nodded, but his voice was low. "That lady, she reminded me of my mama." Larry didn't reply. He didn't need to. They both understood. Gladys Presley had been gone for years, but her memory still sat heavy in every song he sang. Elvis exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I gotta see her again," he said. The Colonel snapped around. "Elvis, no!" The crowd's still outside. It's a madhouse. But he was already walking, past the makeup mirrors, past the dressing rooms, past the rows of reporters waiting for a quote. He pushed through the back exit doors, and there she was, Martha Reynolds, sitting quietly in the hotel lobby, her hands folded around the scarf he'd given her. It looked too big for her shoulders, but she wore it like armor. She turned as he approached. "Mr. Presley," she said softly. Elvis smiled. "Call me Elvis, ma'am. You earned that right tonight." He sat beside her on the velvet bench. No photographers, no fans, no noise. Just two souls who'd collided by chance. Or maybe something bigger. "I don't think I ever thanked you properly," he said. "For what?" she asked. "For reminding me that music's supposed to mean something." Her smile deepened. "Oh, it always did, son. You just forgot for a little while." He laughed. That low, honest kind of laugh that didn't belong on camera. Then she handed him the photograph again. "You keep this," she said. "He'd be mighty proud to know you sang his favorite song." Elvis shook his head. "No, ma'am, you keep it. I just sang. You lived it." For a moment neither spoke. The world outside went on. Taxis honking, fans chanting, neon lights flickering against the hotel glass. But in that tiny corner of quiet, something sacred happened. Elvis reached for a pen from his jacket pocket. On the back of her photo, he didn't write his name. He wrote 2 words. "Keep walking." He handed it back to her, his voice soft. "That's what you told me tonight without saying it." Martha's eyes glistened. "You think I reminded you?" she whispered. "But you reminded me too." "What's that?" he asked. "That I'm still alive." He nodded slowly, his own eyes wet now. "Yes, ma'am, you sure are." Security guards appeared by the doorway, but Elvis waved them off. "Give us a minute," he said. They stepped back, confused but respectful. Martha stood, adjusting the scarf around her neck. "You get some rest, son. Big hearts need it more than big voices," he grinned. "Yes, ma'am. You take care of that scarf now." She turned toward the lobby doors, walking slowly into the warm Vegas night. The scarf glowed under the neon light like a piece of the stage she carried with her. Elvis watched her disappear into the crowd. What if kindness, not applause, is the real legacy of fame? How often do we overlook the small moments that change everything? He looked down at his hands, still shaking from the weight of what had just happened. Then he whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, "Keep walking." And that night, for the first time in years, Elvis slept peacefully. A year later, that same phrase would appear on something millions would see. The months that followed that Vegas night passed in a blur of tour dates, flashbulbs, and hotel rooms. But something had changed in Elvis Presley. He still sang the hits, still drew sold-out crowds, yet friends noticed something softer in him, a kind of peace that had been missing. He smiled more. He prayed longer before each show, and when he handed out scarves to fans, he sometimes whispered the same 2 words under his breath. "Keep walking." No one understood where it came from. Not the Colonel, not the fans, not even the press. But Elvis did. He carried Martha Reynolds' story like a quiet secret. Her photograph stayed pinned inside his guitar case, right next to a small folded note that simply read, "She reminded me who I am." June 1973, Memphis, Tennessee. A radio DJ announced that Elvis had started performing "You'll Never Walk Alone Again," unplanned, at the end of certain concerts. "Every time he sings it," the DJ said, "you can tell he's thinking of someone." The mystery grew. Newspapers speculated. Fans shared whispers in fan clubs and letters. By August, the words "Keep Walking" began showing up on hand-painted fan signs outside Graceland. Nobody knew what it meant. Some thought it was a new song title. Others believed it was a Bible verse. But those who'd been in the Hilton that night, the few lucky enough to have seen that exchange, they knew. They passed it on like folklore. It was something the king said to a grandma. Changed him forever. A year later, tragedy struck. Elvis was gone. The world mourned. Streets lined with candles, fans held vigils outside Graceland, weeping in the rain. And then something curious happened. 2 weeks after his funeral, a small brass plaque appeared on the outer wall near the gates of Graceland. No fanfare, no announcement, just 5 words engraved in quiet gold: "Keep Walking, EP." No one claimed credit. Reporters assumed it was the fan club. The fan club swore it wasn't them. Some said it was placed there by the Presley family. Others whispered it was a gift from a woman from Kansas. But no one could prove it. And yet, fans began to touch it before entering the grounds. As if the words had power, they took photos, rubbed their hands over the engraving, and whispered prayers. One newspaper article from 1978 called it "the gentle commandment of the king." But the truth, as it turned out, came in the form of a letter. That same year, a journalist named Howard Leeds received a small envelope from Topeka, Kansas. Inside was a handwritten note: "Mama passed in peace. She said Mr. Presley gave her back her reason to live. Thank you for telling the world about that night. Evelyn Reynolds, Martha's daughter." At the bottom of the letter was a photo, the same one Elvis had once held on stage. On the back, written in shaky ink, were his words: "Keep walking." The journalist framed it in his office for years. Today, that same photo hangs in a corner of the Graceland archive, labeled only "Hilton Encounter, 1972. Even decades later, fans who read about it online talk about the "keep walking" moment. The night when Elvis turned a concert into a sermon about hope without saying a single preachy word, because what stayed with people wasn't the music or the jumpsuit, it was the silence after her reply, the compassion that broke through all the noise. What if the things that outlive us aren't the records we sell, but the lives we touch? And what if legacy isn't written in fame, but in the moments that no camera ever captures? Every August during Elvis Week, fans still gather near that plaque. Some bring flowers, some hum "You'll Never Walk Alone," and a few quietly place small notes at its base, most of them saying the same thing: "Thank you for reminding me to keep walking." Hidden in the Graceland archives, one photo told the rest of the story. Graceland, 1987. 15 years had passed since that night in Las Vegas, but the story hadn't died. It lived quietly, in fan whispers, in old clippings yellowed by time, in the soft gleam of that brass plaque that simply read, "Keep Walking, EP." That summer, a small team of archivists began sorting through boxes of memorabilia for an upcoming museum exhibit. They expected concert posters, vinyl proofs, ticket stubs. What they didn't expect was a plain white envelope, tucked behind a stack of stage photographs. On the front, faded ink read, "Las Vegas Hilton, Nov 14, 1972. Inside was a single photograph. The edges were torn, the color almost gone, but the image was unmistakable. Elvis on one knee, holding the wrinkled picture of a soldier. Next to him sat the elderly woman in the floral dress, her eyes wet but shining, and across the bottom, in Elvis's unmistakable handwriting, were 3 words: "He's here tonight." The archivists froze. No one spoke. One of them, a young intern named Caroline, whispered, "Is this real?" Her supervisor, a man who'd worked there since the 70s, nodded slowly. "I was there that week. It's real." They logged it, framed it, and placed it in a quiet corner of the Graceland Archive Hall. No spotlight, no announcement, just a small label: "Hilton Showroom, Las Vegas, 1972. Gift of Martha Reynolds, Topeka, Kansas." Most visitors walked right past it, but those who paused said they felt something. Not sadness, not nostalgia, but stillness, the kind of stillness you feel in a church pew or under an open sky. Caroline later wrote in her diary, "I don't know why, but standing there felt like someone whispering, 'Keep walking.'" Outside, the Memphis air hummed with cicadas. Tour buses came and went, but inside that small glass-framed corner, time didn't move. You could almost hear a faint echo, The hiss of a microphone, the roar of 18,000 people, the trembling voice of a woman who dared to speak the truth. Because maybe faith isn't about churches or songs. Maybe it's about believing love outlives the spotlight. Decades later, fans still tell the story. They call it the night the king stopped the music. And for those who listen closely, it's never about celebrity or tragedy. It's about compassion that refused to stay silent. Some even say the photo glows faintly under the evening lights, like the gold ink catches more than just reflection. But maybe that's just what happens when a story becomes something bigger than memory. In the end, it wasn't the fame or the records or the rhinestones that made Elvis unforgettable. It was a moment. One question, one answer, one woman brave enough to tell the truth, that life isn't over yet. And maybe that's all any of us need sometimes, to be seen, to be reminded that our song isn't finished. So if you ever find yourself at Graceland and you happen to walk past that small photograph behind the glass, stop for a second. Look close. You'll see a stage bathed in gold light, a soldier's picture, a scarf draped over a shoulder, and a man who, for once, wasn't singing to a crowd, but listening to a heart. Because sometimes, the loudest song a legend sings is silence. In the end, this story wasn't about a concert. It was about grace, the kind that turns fame into faith. If this moment moved you, share it with someone who needs a reason to keep walking. Because stories like these remind us, no matter how dark the stage gets, someone's light is always shining back.